most South Africans would agree that there's something morally objectionable about raising the apartheid flag in modern day South Africa. The big question is why? Why is it morally objectionable if someone raises the apartheid flag in modern day South Africa? I mean, the problem is not necessarily the object itself. There's nothing wrong about a painting on a piece of cloth. This is not the problem. The problem is what the flag symbolizes, what it means. It symbolizes a particular order in the past, one that was immoral, one that was racist, and one that was oppressive towards black people. So a person who raises that flag in modern day South Africa is embracing and upholding that particular order. So the immorality of it is not necessarily in the object, but rather in what the object symbolizes. Today I'm standing at the center of Pretoria, actually, the city. And behind me is the statue of Paul Kruger. Paul Kruger is, I mean, one of the most prominent Afrikaner presidents who led the South Africa, who led the ZAR, Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, through the Anglo-Boer War in the turn of the century in the 1900s. He was also fundamentally racist. I mean, he's the sort of the forefather of Afrikaner nationalism. And his statue has actually been a very controversial issue. Just after apartheid, there were fights about, I mean, keeping the statue here. But those, I mean, debates, I mean, got silenced over the years. And 2015, with the rise of If Fees Must Fall, the statue was also challenged and it was also vandalized. In fact, as you see it now, the statue is fenced. It wasn't before. It's because of these strikes, and in later years the EFF was also challenging the raising of the statue. The big question is it morally appropriate to keep an apartheid leader's statue at the center of post-apartheid South Africa? That's the big question. Is it problematic to have the statue of a person who symbolized a problematic political order in modern day South Africa? Most people argue that, I mean, the removing of a statue would also imply the erasing of history. That is to say, once we decide to remove Paul Kruger's statue, we'll also be removing a chunk of South Africa's history. And I think this is problematic, I mean, on two grounds. Firstly, usually whatever is written on the statue itself is a biased kind of history. The statue, I mean, if you go to the Paul Kruger statue, you'd realize that there is a lot of praising of the man. He's treated as a veteran in South Africa. I mean, he's treated as a figure that ought to be venerated. But in truth, Kruger was more than this. Kruger was racist. Kruger was a white supremacist. Kruger, I mean, had literally founded the institutions that, I mean, would later bring about black disadvantage and black undermining by white people. So, I mean, that's the one side to it, that statues are not necessarily there to teach us a lot of history. In fact, at best, they are biased historical instruments. But, I mean, secondly, for me, tied to this, is that statues don't necessarily function as educational tools, but rather they function as tools of power. Statues are there not to teach us history or to teach us about the past, but they are there to show us who is in power. This is the reason that, I mean, the Paul Kruger statue was erected in the first place. It was a symbol of power more than it was an instrument of education. Now, don't get me wrong, of course. I do think that we must be taught about Paul Kruger. But I think that the teaching of history must happen in appropriate institutions, schools, museums, and those sorts of things. But statues are more than just history. They are more than just educational tools. Statues are symbols of power. I think there's a similarity between statues and flags in that both take on a symbolic nature. Flags and statues, I mean, symbolize a particular historical political order. I think the big question is, I mean, why is it that it is morally objectionable to raise the old South African flag in modern day South Africa? but it is morally neutral, I mean, to venerate or worship or have the Paul Kruger statue still standing, which represents the very same political order that the old South African flag represents. And the big question is fundamentally, why is Paul Kruger still standing in post-apartheid South Africa?